Hey there, this is Phil. Welcome back to the Holy Post Podcast. I am here with Christian Taylor.
Hello, Phil Vischer.
Hi, Christian. And Sky Jitani.
Hey, everyone.
Hi, everyone. Christian, where have you been lately?
I was in Polson, Montana, which is in the northwest corner, right at the Mission Mountains, the base of the Mission Mountains. It was some kind of beautiful. And now I know why they call it Big Sky.
You saw yourself some big sky?
I did. It was really beautiful.
And where were you the week before that? You were somewhere else. Oh, look, big sky. Sky's camera.
Yes, the week before that, I was in Chandler, Arizona, which was warm and sunny and 70s and lovely.
Small sky?
It was
medium sky?
I would say it was a medium sky. Yes,
okay.
It was a medium. But the atmospheres could not have been more dramatically different.
Yeah, I bet.
I won lots of awards. I did.
That's great. Congratulations on all your
Thanks.
And they all come with large cash prizes, right?
I wish. But my most exciting one, we won 2 best documentaries yesterday, actually. And then we won the audience award at the Polson, Montana Film Festival. Flick is what they call it. And that was super exciting because there were some great films there. So that was nice.
Congratulations.
Awesome. Congratulations. And
thanks.
Now, the theme song. What's the news that you like the most? Who's your favorite podcast host? If it's breakfast, get your toast. It's Sky and Phil and the Holy Post. Sky and Phil and the Holy Post. And sometimes Christian. Okay, last week's animal news was so popular that I had to bring it back by popular demand. I got so much mail over that one. So here we go. News of here. I'll do the little message for it. It's animal news.
I don't think that's the same song.
That wasn't the same one you did last time.
I change it every time. Target drops Choco coconut milk. Did you hear about this? Target drops Choco coconut milk because of allegations of forced monkey labor.
What? All right, unpack. I'm curious.
I didn't know you could get monkeys to work for you.
PETA has been pushing stores to stop selling coconut milk allegedly made with coconuts harvested by monkeys since it began investigating the alleged animal exploitation in 2019. And Target agreed because the company Choco could not
Wait. Can you spell it? Can you spell it? Because that's horrible.
Chaokoh.
Chacoa.
No, Chaokoh.
Chacoa.
No.
Chocoa.
No, the last syllable is KOH. That's not koa.
Right.
Okay, Choco.
Yes, it is.
KOH is not koa.
Okay, so it could be ko.
Choco.
Choco. Except it's A then O in the first syllable.
Cheoka.
Yeah,
whatever.
See? You don't have a clue.
The coconut milk people.
So apparently this is news. I didn't know you could do this. There are coconut plantations that have learned how to train monkeys captive monkeys to climb up the trees and harvest coconuts.
That can't be very hard. You just give them a treat when they do it. Like they accidentally knock one down, you give them a treat, you send them back up, That can't be that hard.
Okay, but there are many agricultural enterprises that employ animals.
I just want to point out that the monkeys, they're like, oh, look what they're doing to us. Oh, they're making us pick coconuts, which is one of our natural behaviors. And then the cows are saying, do you know what they're doing to us? Do you know? They're eating us. They're eating us. And the monkeys are like, yeah, but we're not getting paid.
What about like sheepdogs and other herding animals like that?
Are they getting paid?
Or
our
like
society's gone a little crazy with the let's treat everybody with respect and dignity.
Or the peregrine falcons that like clear other birds out of the airport so they don't get sucked into engines and things. Like we use animals all the time to do this.
That's a thing. I didn't know that was a thing.
What about using pigeons to deliver messages in World War II?
They
Yeah,
make
what
even
about
less
that?
than Uber Eats drivers.
I don't know if the argument is. I think the argument is that they were keeping them in bad conditions. You know, they were like had metal collars on and they were chained up when they weren't.
Okay,
You know,
that's
then
different. If you're
now
being
here's your
cruel to the animals, sure, that's bad.
yeah,
But if you're just
but
merely using them like we use animals for all kinds of labor, I'm
so
not sure
for,
that's the problem.
if we're just giving, because I think even monkeys feel like they should have meaningful work, right?
Have you interviewed one lately that I missed?
Everybody benefits from meaningful labor,
Yeah,
something
I'm
to
sure that
do.
those monkeys that sat next to the organ grinders and clapped cymbals
Yeah.
were
Have the
really feeling
monkeys formed a
fulfilled.
union yet?
They got to they got to meet new people every day. I don't know how to feel about
The
this.
monkey business union?
Because on one hand, I'm thinking, no, you should not exploit the monkeys. You should not exploit the monkeys. They're beautiful, intelligent creatures. And then I look over and a pig is just staring at me like, seriously? Seriously? I'm a beautiful and intelligent creature too.
Well,
Seriously?
and you even take I mean, but think about we've used everything to plow since time began.
Yeah. Except
That's
monkeys.
kind of like
We have not,
bondage
we,
and masochistic stuff.
we should try it with monkeys. Okay, this was animal news. I just wasn't sure what to think of that. I had no idea there was forced monkey labor in the
I bet it's
world.
kind of funny, actually. I'd like to see it myself.
Oh yeah, until you see the tears of the monkeys. It's like,
If they
oh,
were
is it
if
6
they were
a.m. already? Just let me sleep another hour. Oh,
if they
poor
were kept in cruelty, that would be a problem.
poor monkeys. Poor monkeys. Okay, here's what I want to talk about today. And we don't have a ton of time because I have something special. I have something special after this. We're going to talk for a little bit, and then I have another segment that I'm going to do, bring in a friend to talk about something very important that everyone is going to go, wow, how did we live without having this conversation before? And then we'll have a regular interview after that. So we have about half the time for the news, maybe a little less than the normal news time. But here's what I want to talk about. I want to talk about charismatic prophets, okay? Because there are two groups that are having to figure out what to do next. One is QAnon devotees. The other are followers and the charismatic prophets themselves, who all predicted, the QAnon supporters all predicted that it was going to be Trump inaugurated and then he was going to arrest all the pedophile, cannibal Democrats and put them all in jail. That was supposed to happen. It didn't happen. All the prophets, like at least 40 charismatic prophets, at least. You're muted, Sky.
Can you
Yeah,
please use air quotes when you say prophets?
we'll get to that. We'll get to
All
that.
right.
But here's what I wanted to go back first. First, I wanted to go back and talk about the Millerites. Can we talk about the Millerites?
Is
I've
that
never heard of
they're the ones
those.
who made the beer, right?
No, they're not the ones. The Millerites were the followers of the teachings of William Miller, who in 1831 first shared publicly his belief that the second coming of Jesus Christ, or second advent, would occur in roughly the year 1843 or 1844. Coming during the Second Great Awakening, his beliefs were taken as predictions, spread widely, and were believed by many. From 1840 onward, Millerism was transformed from an obscure regional movement into a national campaign. They used media to spread the ideas of Millerism. He had a bi-weekly paper called Signs of the Times. There were at least 48 Millerite regular publications that circulated in mostly the Northwest, but also into Canada, which led up to an event called, and this is a great name, after you've had the Great Awakening and the Second Great Awakening, what do you have next?
The Third Great Awakening.
The Great Disappointment.
Oh.
The Great Disappointment was when 1844 closed out and Jesus had not come back. And all the Millerites were terribly confused, terribly disappointed. Some of them lost their faith entirely. Some of them became Shakers and actually influenced the direction of Shaker communities. Others formed the Advent Christian Church, and another group split off and formed Seventh-day Adventist Church. That's where Seventh-day Adventists came from a group of disappointed Millerites. So I'm bringing that up because it was another time in history when everybody had figured out what was going to happen and they were really excited about it, and then it didn't happen, and they had to figure out what to do next. And it splintered off and actually still influences, if you think about, the influence of things like Seventh-day Adventism, still influences America today. So, okay, charismatic prophets. Our friend John Fia wrote extensively about the Independent Network Charismatics, the INC, and it's the fastest growing Christian movement in both the Western world and the global South. INC Christians are outside the network of traditional Pentecostals, so they're kind of freelance prophets, Pentecostal movement with self-proclaimed prophets that I have to put in air quotes so that Sky's okay with it.
Mhm.
They're not affiliated in any way with the National Association of Evangelicals. Inc. Christianity, INC, is a network of authoritative spiritual leaders with very large followings. Folks like Bill Johnson, who is the founder of Bethel Church in Redding, California. If you like Bethel worship music, that comes from an Inc. pastor. Chuck Pierce in Texas, Cindy Jacobs in Texas, Mike Bickle from the International House of Prayer in Kansas City, Missouri, Lou Engle, The Call in Colorado Springs. My favorite name for a prophet, Dutch Sheets. Do you know Dutch Sheets?
Better than Dutch oven.
I prefer Egyptian sheets, but I guess the Dutch aren't bad either. Dutch Sheets Ministries of Dallas,
Their
Texas.
sheets are made of wood, though.
Lance Wallnow, who has spent a lot of time with Eric Metaxas lately from Dallas, Texas. Jeremiah Johnson of Charlotte, North Carolina. Kat Kerr of Jacksonville, Florida. Sean Bowles of Studio City, California. So guys like Eric Metaxas have ended up kind of falling into this tribe, and a lot of the people, like if a lot of the people that were around Trump in his circle of evangelical advisors were INC Christians, charismatics. They are deeply attracted to something called Seven Mountain Dominionism, which is the belief that Jesus will not return until society comes under the dominion of Jesus Christ. Inc. prophets want to reclaim 7 cultural mountains: family, government, arts and entertainment, media, business, education, and religion.
Which is a weird kind of post-millennial view for them to
Yes.
hold.
Yes, that is, in fact, that's something that Tim LaHaye also held, but he was premillennial. He's one of the more famous, prominent premillennialists because that's what the Left Behind books are about.
Right.
But he also felt that Christians needed to take over culture to perfect it so Jesus could come back,
which is post-millennial. Yeah, it's ridiculous.
Yes.
It's kind of weird.
So there's a very strange premillennial, postmillennial mashup going on here. And then almost all of these INC prophets started prophesying in favor of Trump, like a whole little club. I don't know if any of them prophesied, "Hey, Biden's going to win."
Well,
God just told me that Biden's going to win.
Their audience doesn't want to hear that.
But they're not just they don't think they're making it up. As early as 2007, Inc. prophet Kim Clement received a word from God: Trump shall become a trumpet. That was clever of God. I will raise up Trump to become a trumpet and Bill Gates to open up the gate of a financial realm for the church.
So Gates is going to be a gate and Trump's going to be a trumpet.
Yeah.
What about Sheets? Is he going to be a sheet? How literal is all this naming going to go?
And Obama's going to be the bomb. I don't know. 2016, Lance Wallnow received a similar message. Donald Trump is a wrecking ball to the spirit of political correctness.
I actually agree with that.
Me too.
Not sure it's a good thing. So, then this just caught fire in Inc. circles. And it's important to know that Independent Network Charismatics, it's not an American thing. It is American, but it's also, South American, heavily across South America and more in Africa as well. So it is a global South and American movement.
One of the key things to remember, you keep using that term independent charismatic network. The independent thing basically means these folks largely have no accountability. They're not part of any kind of ecclesiastical structure that they must give an account to or hold to the doctrinal statement of or whatever. So they can get away with all kinds of...
You're such a Pharisee.
No, but seriously, like the accountability, just accountability in general is not a bad thing for Christian leaders. And Many of these folks have none.
Right. So at least 40 charismatic Christian leaders predicted Trump's reelection starting around 2018. Only a handful had predicted it in 2016, but everybody jumped on in this second election. And now they're trying to figure out what to do. And it's very interesting. I've watched a few of the video clips where they're wrestling with, what do we do? What do we do? It's still going to happen? Is it still going to happen? What not one of them has said is, hey, guess what? I'm a false prophet.
Yeah, that would be selling the store, wouldn't it?
I guess so, but it's also what the Bible says. If your prophecy is false, you're a false prophet.
I've heard some of them spin that they didn't predict he would win in 2020. They just predicted that he would have two terms. So now they're beginning to say he'll be elected again in 2024, which is going to fulfill their prophecy now.
What I don't understand, I just want to talk about this a little bit because we don't have a ton of time, because of my special thing that's coming up next. What's the attraction to Trump for all of them? Because if you take if you take Catholicism, if you take the Episcopal Church, if you take most evangelical branches, there are a lot of Trump supporters, but there are also critics. There are also voices that say, hey, I don't think he's very Christian, and I'm not wild about all his policies. And yet within this circle, it is almost 100%, this is God's man. It's Cyrus. He's going to save us. So, one of the quotes was, they formed a group, some of these prophets formed a group called the POTUS Shield, which is not for male incontinence. It's a whole different thing. It's to surround the president of the United States. Sorry, Sky. To serve as a kind of spiritual support group for God's new Cyrus, who will lead America back to spiritual and economic prosperity and help to set the stage for the dominion of Jesus Christ over all the earth. That's what they built Trump into. He's going to set the stage for Jesus to have dominion over the earth.
I think there's probably two explanations to your question, Phil.
Yes.
At least. One is the types of folks who get deeply enmeshed in these kinds of ministries tend to be, they're attracting a populist audience, which is very similar to the audience that Donald Trump appealed to. And so I think some of these leaders intuitively understand what their audience wants to hear. Their audience is very, very, very pro-Trump. And so they're feeding them all of this rhetoric that lines up with that and keeps the dollars flowing, keeps the people tuning in, keeps them engaged. But number two, and I credit Russell Moore with this, years ago, we had him on and we were asking him, why are so many Christians attracted to Trump? And I think his explanation applies specifically to the Independent Charismatic Network, is Trump epitomizes what many of these charismatic leaders want to be themselves. This
macho man.
Yeah, a macho man who dictates how things go. They see in Trump an image of what they aspire to be. And that, combined with the fact that their audience also is the same as Trump's audience, conspires to create the Venn diagrams overlap almost entirely.
Christian, what do you think? What do we do? What do we do with this little club of crazy?
I can't even begin to speculate. I'm going to leave that to you guys.
Okay, and I wonder how much overlap there is between Christian nationalists who just say, America was supposed to be Christian, and Christian dominionists who say, we need a strong man on our side so that we can change things so that Jesus will come back and rule the earth.
Ultimately, it comes down to what Sky has talked about, and even you have been tweeting about recently, which is controlling our fears.
Yeah.
We want some way to mitigate the fears that we have of losing control or not being in power. It's mitigating our fears and wanting to be in power. And I think, wanting to be with the cool kids.
Yeah, well, Christian's absolutely right. And to that end, I think part of the appeal of the more abusive end of the charismatic movement, of the abusive end of the prophecy movement, is prophecies are used as a way to mitigate people's fear. If I know what's going to happen in the future, if somebody can tell me what's going to unfold, then I can have a sense of control and I don't have to be surprised. I don't have to be afraid. And that's
Right.
exactly what a lot of politics is doing right now, is saying, if you just elect us, if you just put the orange man in the circle room, like I joked about a couple episodes ago, then you don't have to be afraid. Then everything will be under control. Then the world will go the way you want. So it's all rooted in fear. And it's ironically exactly what scripture warns against. We're not supposed to be engaged in that kind of divination and future telling as a way to mitigate our fears. We're supposed to put our trust in God, who has already proven he's all powerful and that he loves us by allowing his son to die for us and raising him from the dead. That's where we put our faith and hope, not into some dynamic leader with big hair who tells us about the future.
Right.
Amen.
I want to keep an eye on this whole movement just because it's so, it's so affected the last administration. It's, affected friends of mine. It affected Eric Metaxas. It's affected, it shows up on TBN and Christian radio. So we need to keep an eye on it because it's especially through social media. And that's another parallel with the Millerites. The Millerism thrived because they were so good at using newspapers, at publishing their own media, and that's how it spread. And we have things today, little, perversions of Christianity that thrive because of social media.
Yep.
So it's very interesting to look at. And now I'm going to bring out my friend Mike Erie to do something that's going to be fun for everyone involved. Okay, here we go. I'm here with my friend Mike Erie.
And let me just ask this, Phil, before we get started.
Mike.
Do I get top billing in this episode, or
no, you don't. No,
Okay.
no.
All right.
There's another
There's
guest.
a friend slot. There's a friend slot that I'm in.
This is something new. In fact, I don't think we've ever done this before, of having two guests in one episode. Because I just had this idea like a couple days ago, and the main guest was already booked and recorded and everything. But I said,
we'll call them the main guest.
You're the warm up act. You're
the appetizer.
Yeah, you're the warm up.
Yes.
Okay. But here's so Mike. So you did your podcast, the Vox podcast, VOX Vox podcast. Look it up; it's fantastic. I listen to it every week. This week you're going through the Sermon on the Mount.
Yes.
This week you talked about, which will be now last week as we put this out. You talked about judgment.
Jesus talked about it.
You, Mike Erie, talked about judgment.
I was just channeling Jesus.
And you talked about, for a follower of Jesus, when Jesus says, "Do not judge, lest you be judged." What does he mean? And you said there's good judgment and bad judgment. So just summarize that little nugget.
Yes.
Good judgment and bad judgment. What do you mean by that? Because then I have to give you a hypothetical or not so hypothetical scenario so you can tell me whether I have been guilty of good judgment or bad judgment.
I think we all know that you are not a fan of good judgment. We've seen this over and over and over again, particularly in your choice of podcast co-hosts. But that's that's neither here nor there. No. So Jesus uses this word krino, which means to separate or to categorize.
Yes.
It's where we get critique or criticism, and the idea is is
that where we get critical race theory? Critical?
No, we get that from the pit of hell, Phil. I thought we were very clear about that. I'm being sarcastic, of course, but So Jesus discourages the kind of judgment that leads to condemnation. In fact, in the parallel passage in Luke, he even says, "Don't condemn or you'll be condemned," right after he says, "Don't judge or you'll be judged." So it's a condemning kind of judgment where we infer from actions or words something about the person's worth or motives or character. The good kind of judgment, he encourages all over the place. And one way to distinguish is that the judgment that he rules out is a judgment of people, the sheep and the goats, the good and the bad, the heroes and the villains. But he does encourage a judgment of things. This is wise or unwise, right, wrong, true, false. And he practices that all over the place.
Ideologies, systems.
Yes. Yep.
Okay, but not people.
Right.
So I can judge Nazism, but I can't judge Hitler?
Yes. Yeah, Hitler's an image bearer, big
I
boy.
feel like I want to judge Hitler.
Yeah, well, it depends on what kind of
Okay.
judgment we're talking about here. But in all sincerity,
Yeah.
what judgment does is it cuts us off from seeing the person beyond their act. So take Hitler, an absolute atrocity, no question. It happened and it was awful. Um, but I'm not in a place of moral supremacy where I can sit and start pointing out those sorts of things unless I've first dealt with, according to Jesus, the 2x4 in my own eye, then I can
Okay.
pick out the sins of other people. So I haven't
Okay.
murdered anybody or consigned people to death in the same
Mhm.
way. But I think there's something in the idea that we can say that what he did was utterly wrong, absolutely abhorrent. He deserves whatever judgment is coming to him, and he's still an image bearer that God loves. I mean,
Okay.
that's
Okay.
just true.
All right. So here's what so now that
So,
you've
way to throw the Hitler example out there first.
yeah, I want to start with the easy stuff. And now we'll get to the hard stuff. Um, because so we should confess our sins one to another and occasionally confront one another.
Hmm.
So you might need to confront me.
Okay.
Okay. So you know how you deputize every now and then you'll unofficially deputize someone. You're a deputy now. You go
Yep.
arrest. Okay. So
Yes.
I'm not sure what the pastoral equivalent is, but I am giving you pastoral authority,
A proxy.
temporary,
Okay.
not permanent, temporary to to confront me,
Yes.
okay, and tell me that I'm out of line, okay?
I love it. You're out of
And this
line. I
okay, and
guarantee it. Whatever
this
you
is
did
important
is
be
wrong.
because people tell me quite often online, on social media, that I'm doing it wrong.
Mm,
And I usually ignore them because I don't know them. I don't know you. Don't tell me I'm
right.
doing it wrong when I don't even know you. Okay, so I had an interaction with someone, and this is actually someone who has there are people that do this online. I don't know if you've noticed, but they don't really want to engage with in a conversation with you. What they really want to do is drive by your house and throw an egg and then keep on driving, just a drive by egging.
Right.
And so there's a person, and I won't not gonna use any names, but he's actually a known Christian apologist, okay?
Mm,
Y not not A level, not Ravi Zacharias, William Lane Craig level apologist, Norman Geisler a level down. He's level down. So a B level Christian apologist, but he has a following, and he has now attacked me 2 or 3 times on
hmm.
Twitter
Hmm.
for being, liberal or woke or, whatever
Has
the
he
the
attacked you or your views?
well, this is a week ago, okay?
Okay.
A week ago, he tweeted out of nowhere, just tweeted, "As a graduate of Fuller Seminary, I am just wondering why anyone is all hyped up about someone like Phil Vischer. I mean," and and then it goes so you following? Are you following? You're with okay.
Yeah.
And
I
he
actually
continued.
saw this.
Okay. I mean, leftists do their leftist thing and show off their leftist filters all the time. Did you all grow up on VeggieTales and think him inspired or something? Okay. So that was the tweet,
Yeah.
and I'm just like, "Wait, where did that come from? What did
Yeah.
what
Yeah.
was the what
Yeah.
was the thing of the
What is he subtweeting?
Yeah, so he wasn't subtweeting anything. It was out of the blue. So I responded, and because we've already had a round like this a while ago where I said, "Well, let's talk about this more," and then he wouldn't respond. But he has, fans, and so all of them, jump on to throw their little eggs at you. Yay, little eggs. I was like, "Well, this is ridiculous." So I kind of knew that he wasn't serious about engaging. So I responded, especially with his Fuller Seminary comment, which just seemed out of nowhere, that I'm just following in the footsteps of moderate evangelicals like Carl Henry and Harold Ockenga, who founded Fuller Seminary. I'm not sure what classes you took there, but if I'm your idea of a leftist, you need to travel the world, friend. So was that was a little bit sarcastic. I
That
don't
was
know. Was that
beautiful. No,
That
that
was
was
you
beautiful.
think that was okay?
Yes,
Okay.
absolutely. I judge you okay.
That was okay. Okay. So but then I wasn't done. And this is maybe
Oh,
where
okay. Well, this and then there here we go. Here we go.
because I realized, oh, there's so many people, and now I decided that I needed to attack an idea, okay?
Yep.
But I'm not sure if in doing so, I successfully restrained my attack to the idea, or did I attack the person? Because
Oh.
some people said I attacked the person, and,
Mm.
if that's the case, then I owe him an apology. Um Hang on, where I had it pulled up. Where'd it go? Hang on, I got so I thought just the idea of, telling everyone that isn't as conservative as you are on any issue that they're a leftist or a liberal or a Marxist or a communist or, a non-Christian or you don't believe the Bible. I mean, just this blanket, you're bad
I know.
because,
I
you
know.
know, because I'm more conservative than you on immigration policy, for example. So it kind of reminded me, maybe you didn't see this part. It kind of reminded me of the Red Scare in the 50s, with
Oh,
Senator
I
Joseph
didn't see this part.
McCarthy.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So I wrote a little piece of satire, which I do every now and then. And it's basically me being called before
Mm.
the Senate panel on un-American activities.
To see
You
if
know,
you left enough.
yeah, 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 to see if I'm too left. So and then I posted this on the Holy Post just
Wow.
as a little piece of humor writing. And it's entitled Dear Senator McCarthy. So because I didn't want to use the guy's name, so I just took it into a different historical context. Um, and so here's what I wrote. Okay. I said, by leftist, I assume you mean communist. No, Senator McCarthy, I'm not and have never been a member of the Communist Party. I'm a red blooded Christian American committed to Jesus and free markets, mostly in that order. After much self reflection, okay, hang with me here, I recognize how you might have come to this false conclusion. After all, at one point in my youth, I had two roommates and we shared some expenses and food. But I have repented of that. I also, in my youth, enjoyed listening to the Christian rock group Resurrection Band, whose
Oh.
bandmates were members of an actual Christian commune in Chicago. But I have repented of that also. And since we're on the topic of music, my family really enjoyed the late 70s Christian band's Second Chapter of Acts, which was problematic both because they chose as their name the most leftist chapter in the Bible, and also because their harmonies were so tight and hairstyles so similar, it was difficult to discern with any confidence which one was the boy. I, I don't know if you know that group, but it's two girls and a
I
boy, and they
I
were all
do not.
siblings. I'll send you some. It's fantastic. Second Chapter of Acts, fantastic. They had a moment in the sun that was amazing in the late 70s, early 80s.
Nice.
I now realize boys with high voices and long hair are yet another step on a slippery slope towards socialized medicine. Uh, not only have I rejected these potentially leftist Christian influences, I have removed the entire second chapter of Acts from my Bible, lest it causes me to stumble and arise one day wearing Bernie Sanders mittens purchased on Etsy.
Oh,
Uh,
good lord.
which, if we're honest, is probably a communist sleeper cell. Etsy, that is, not Bernie Sanders mittens. Wait, scratch that. They're both communist sleeper cells. Don't worry, sir. I am no Hugo Chavez. I will not attempt to nationalize our industries, ruining our economy. Neither will I follow Chavez's lead and import so many hippopotamuses for my personal menagerie that their excrements disrupt the natural ecosystem of our rivers. Oh, you didn't know about that? Clearly, you don't host a podcast with a recurring segment entitled News of the Butt. Now, technically, I was wrong about that, and several people pointed out it was Pablo Escobar in
Mm,
Colombia who imported hippos and is ruining the ecosystem, not Chavez in Venezuela. So, all
okay.
right.
Well,
So
we can repent of that.
there's sin number one.
Yes.
I
Utter
apologize.
falsehood.
And then this is how I ended up. I apologize for any statements I may or may not have made that caused such concern and required our mutual attendance at this hearing. Thank you, Senator McCarthy, for giving me this opportunity to clear my name, and particularly for using your patriotism and intellect to keep the American church communist free. Fuller Seminary must be proud. So I posted that, and
Yeah.
and then and a lot of people thought it was funny, but a lot of people started attacking the guy who started it all, so now I'm seeing fans of mine attack him and, call him an idiot, and then people are saying, "Wow, he must have really struck a nerve for you to go to the trouble of writing that." I thought, "No, actually, I just thought it was funny. I was just writing." But I do now, so I guess the reason I'm asking you is that I do feel a little uncomfortable with this, and I
Why?
don't.
Because people reacted to it.
Um, it's I think if I don't know, could it have been more cleanly about an idea and not about a person? And maybe it's just because I pulled in the Fuller Seminary reference at the end, which links it more directly back to his, but just the thought that Fuller Seminary would care about putting out.
Totally. Well,
I don't know.
Phil,
Mike,
yeah,
buddy.
yep. First of all, let me deal with the plank in my own eye. I have been sarcastic in the past, and I have never listened to the second chapter of Acts. And and I've tweeted and responded poorly. Having said all of that, I judge you to be in the right and in the clear as much as I want to condemn you, because I really do. I'm looking for any reason. Um, you're just getting too big for your britches, my friend.
But isn't there okay.
But nope, nope. Let me give my justification, Phil. When you look, and I'm going to get serious for a second. I know this is super playful, but
Go
when you
ahead.
look at Paul's rhetorical strategies in the New Testament, he would use stuff like this. You are doing a reductio ad absurdum. You find this absurd that you would be called a leftist, and so you just take that.
What did I
Take that.
do? I cast a Harry Potter spell? What I
Reductio.
ad
That's funny.
absurdum?
That's funny.
Wow.
No, this is a rhetorical strategy, and because it's a public forum, I didn't hear you. I didn't hear you go after this person at all. My goodness, Phil.
Okay.
No, no,
Okay. Really?
yes,
Okay. Okay. Because I feel like but what if, okay, maybe it's my motive that I'm wrestling with, because there's a part of me on the inside that when someone throws a rock at me
yeah,
publicly, I
yeah.
want to get even.
That's facts. Yeah,
Yeah, but it's not good.
no, and Jesus does kind of rule that sort of returning
Right.
evil for evil out.
Right.
For sure.
So,
But see, I can't see, that's where the condemnation comes in. I can't read your motive, and if
okay.
you're uncomfortable with it, then great. But
Okay.
just as a rhetorical piece, I find it really funny, and I find it effective at pointing out the absurdity of calling Phil Vischer woke and leftist.
Okay.
And
Okay.
so yeah,
Okay.
instead,
Because this
well,
brings to a bigger issue, that I mentioned ahead of time, so you could do a whole lot of research and thinking about it and present something brilliant now. How the desire not to judge, the
mhm.
goal not to judge, how much does that constrain the desire to be funny?
Oh, see, that's genius. That's genius.
I like to
That's such a
write
good question.
comedy,
Right.
and it's so
Which
hard. Mm.
That's right. That's right. Well, I think we all know the comedy that is gentle and kind and the comedy that is cruel and vicious.
Mhm.
Your name is not Phil Vicious. And so you are so I mean, again, I want to be funny right now, but you're asking really good questions. So Jesus, before he ever gets to judgment, Jesus deals with anger and contempt. And so if our comedy is filled with contempt, then there's no place for it. I think
Right.
Jesus had a great sense of humor and irony and sarcasm, and so I think all of that's fair game. And what you were doing, like I said, I think it's I mean, Paul used these rhetorical strategies all the freaking time, and I think they're brilliant. So I think what you did was a brilliant response. But that
Okay.
bit about I was insulted publicly, so I must respond publicly. That now we're getting into the stuff that Jesus really cares about, right? He
Yeah.
doesn't care about your tweets. He
Yeah.
really cares about that part of us that rises up in defense of ourselves.
Yeah.
And when we're secure enough in the kingdom, and it sounds like fairy tale language, but Dallas Willard just talked this way. When you're secure enough in the kingdom to the point where you just don't have to defend your name, reputation, or self, right? That's the goal.
Right. That's a
And
great goal.
yeah, it is a great goal, and I'm not there.
How does one achieve that, Yoda? How do we get to that mountaintop of
How do we
perfect
get
zen?
there?
Yeah.
Therapy, spiritual direction, and spiritual disciplines. That's how we get there. There's no other way.
Oh,
I
man,
know.
that sounds like it would take time and effort.
I know. That's why it's easier to just say let go and let God.
What's the Holy Spirit for? Where's the
Yes.
magic? Where's the magic? What's
Oh.
that Latin phrase I'm supposed to say? Ridiculum esperoso.
No, but Phil, I love it. I love what you're saying, because what social media has given us great permission to do is to use rhetorical strategies that we would never use in person to defend our false selves. To not only portray a false self, but then have to defend it. And it is
Mm,
so hard
mm.
to grow beyond that. Absolutely.
So when someone, because there's part of me where I can justify it.
Of
I don't know
course.
if you have this, where, okay, that person is trying to get me deplatformed.
Yeah.
They're trying to stick a label to me that will make other Christians or Christian organizations say, "Oh, wait a minute, can we work with him?
Yeah.
Can we promote him? I
Yep.
hear
Yep.
he's a communist."
Yes.
So part of me is like, well, I have to defend my platform, my ministry. But man, people do terrible things in the defense of their ministries,
Right.
including covering up abuse and, just all sorts of things that people do. So
So here's the
can,
great question.
yeah,
So I'm a Bible teacher by profession and passion. And my therapist looked at me one day and just simply asked these questions. Just one question. When you teach, whose wounds are you trying to heal? And I went, there it is. There is the great revealer
mm,
of, am I teaching to cover my shame
right,
by overlaying competence?
So can I paraphrase that question?
Yes.
When you tweet, whose wounds are you trying to heal?
Yeah,
Or
exactly. Because there's
whose,
a place,
yeah,
Phil, you're absolutely right, for clarity, for delineation, for discernment, for saying, no, that's simply not true. And I think humor is one of the incredible and most powerful ways to get through the chatter these days.
yeah.
J-
Can we tell someone they've said something silly without
yes.
saying you are a,
Yep.
you know,
Knucklehead.
less worthwhile person?
Of
You're not, I'm
course.
not saying you're a silly person, but you just said something silly. That's
Yes.
okay? Okay.
Oh, man, absolutely. Paul does that all the time. So is Jesus.
Will you give me a letter that you sign that says that's okay?
I am
Something.
giving right now, for this short season where I am a pastoral proxy, speaking fully into your life, Phil. First of all, I think you probably need to eat more spinach. Secondly, as far as co-hosts go, okay, I think there are other bald guys that are better looking.
Okay.
Um, and then thirdly, one of the things I greatly respect about you is that you are introspective enough to even wonder about such things.
Oh, okay.
Fantastic. I don't know if the other person is owed an apology or not, but the fact that there's this ping in your internal world about it, okay, well, let's follow that. And then we took it to, what did the word say? Well, those seem fine. So it was the heart, right? It was it was having
Right,
to,
right. Am I getting even?
yeah. And of course it always is justified. That's the beautiful thing about contempt and revenge and whatever else, right? Anger is always righteous. And I'd
Yeah.
feel the same way, dude. That's my log, is like, I would feel and have done so similarly. And there have been times I've let things go that I should have addressed because they did end up staining. And there are times when I didn't let things go that I should have. And the only way I know how to walk well is by doing what you're doing, actually inviting people in to say, I mean, and that, again, no one lives like this, but this is what the church was to be, this kind
Right.
of community where you'd say, here's really what I want to do. This is what I want to say. How does it feel? And when I'm healthy, my wife will read the emails I want to send and the tweets I want to put out. And when I'm not, I just send those things, in a burst of self-righteousness and go on.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, I appreciate that. That was very helpful, and I think everyone else will find that helpful because we're all, navigating this new world where
Totally.
everyone has a platform.
Yeah.
Everyone has a platform.
And there is harm out there.
Yes,
We have to call it out. Your
right.
Hitler example, like that put me on my back feet for example, because we have to condemn him. We have to. And yet there's a part of that can be energized, that can energize my own self-righteousness that Jesus would then call into question.
Right.
You know what I
Right.
mean? And
Yeah.
so, and we have to oppose.
I'm not the kind of person that could ever do anything like that.
Right,
Not that kind of person. Now, if you'd like me to tell you what other people are that kind of person,
right,
even if they haven't done Hitler, but they
right.
could. They could.
Yes, yes. See, and the thing about condemnation is it gives us a hit. I mean, that's why
Yeah.
outrage is so popular. It energizes us, and it gives us a lift. So anyway, what a fun
Fantastic.
convo, bro. Thank you.
We can't take any more time because Sky actually has his guest now.
The
He
main
wants
guy.
to yeah. But thank you, Pastor Mike. Okay, Mike, have a great day.
All right, buddy. Thanks.
Next week marks the beginning of Lent, the 40-day season leading up to Easter. If you're looking for a new way to deepen your connection with God, engage Scripture more thoughtfully, and to start your day with something more meaningful than social media or emails, I encourage you to check out With God Daily, the daily devotional for people who hate daily devotionals. Right now in With God Daily, we're going through a series looking at the sermons of Martin Luther King Jr. and pulling out different topics that relate to contemporary struggles that Christians have. And beginning in March, while we're still in Lent, we're going to be looking at Jesus' farewell discourse from the Gospel of John, a perfect way to prepare ourselves for the celebration of Easter. Subscribers to With God Daily can access it 5 days a week via email or with the mobile app. It includes a reading for the day, scripture passages that you can link to, historic prayers of the church, the occasional doodle on my part to illustrate the points, and every day there's an audio version for those who prefer to listen. The With God Daily email, app, audio version, all of it are available to anyone who makes a donation of any amount to support our ministry. So if you'd like to learn more or explore how this resource might help you deepen your faith throughout the season of Lent, or to sign up, I encourage you to go to withgoddaily.com. As I'm sure you know, there have been mountains of research papers done on the faith of millennials. There's been books written and seminars. But what about the next generation after the millennials, Generation Z? There hasn't been a ton of research done yet on the faith of Generation Z, which no doubt will be deeply impacted by current events, by things like social media, and the deep divisions that exist today in American culture and the American church. That's why I'm so happy to have Dr. Joshua Packard with us today. He's the executive director of Springtide Research Institute, and they've just completed one of the largest studies on the faith of Generation Z. Josh Packard is an accomplished researcher, speaker, and academic studying the sociology of religion and new forms of religious expression. I've sort of been a fan of his ever since 2015 when I read a book he wrote, co-authored with Ashley Hope, called Church Refugees. The book was really impactful, and I've never had a chance to talk to Josh Packard before, so I was super excited to have him on the show to talk about not just this new research about Gen Z, but also that book from 5 years ago. And the good news is, if you're a Patreon supporter, you're going to get to hear a bonus interview I have with Josh Packard talking about church refugees and why every church leader needs to read that book. Anyway, here is my conversation with Josh Packard about the faith of Generation Z. Josh Packard, welcome to the Holy Post.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Yeah, I'm really grateful to see you here. We got a message from Springtide Research Institute, where you are, about this new study you've done, and our assistant Julie had sent me this message saying, do you want to have Josh Packard on? I'm like, wait a minute. Is this the same Josh Packard who wrote Church Refugees? Because I've referenced that book frequently over the last 5 years, and I looked you up,
Thank you.
and you were the same Josh Packard. So he said, yes, let's have him on. I want to talk to him. We'll get into church refugees later in that book. But the reason you're coming on initially is because you guys at Springtide have done a recent study about Gen Z and faith and religion and a number of other topics. My kids are in this generation. They're different than millennials, but just to start us off, can you just define who is Gen Z for us?
Yeah, well, Gen Z, I mean, is really, I mean, these things are loosely defined anyway, but anywhere around mid-20s to lower is sort of how we are loosely holding this. That might be stretching it to the upper age limits there. Um, but the bottom age, at least for Springtide's concerns, for privacy reasons, we go down to 13 years old, and that's sort of the sweet spot for us, is 13 to 25-year-old. So it takes from about the time of most rites of passage for major religions, so confirmation, bar and bat mitzvahs, et cetera, all the way up to what most social scientists would consider to be sort of the end of emerging adulthood and like the time of actual adulthood. As recent studies say, that's 25 is about the time people are moving out of their homes. So that's the age range we really focus on.
So as a church leader, as an editor at CT, I feel like for the last, 15 years, I have been swamped by research about millennials.
Sure.
Everyone has something to say about millennials. And now we're beginning to see stuff coming out about the next generation, Gen Z.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any way this is unfair because there's no nuance in this, but what's the difference between millennials and Gen Z, other than obviously Gen Z is younger, but are there sociological differences that you've been able to find already?
Well, I mean, to put it like in its starkest terms, I mean, the upper age of millennials are the parents of Gen Z, in some cases already. So it is sort of, things are sort of shifting. I think the overall profile of Gen Z is still sort of emerging, obviously, but the best, I think the sort of best consensus that we have is that a lot of the sort of cracks in the sort of institutional trust, which is probably something we're going to talk about here in a little bit, that were sort of first shown to be emerging with millennials are accelerating with Gen Z. I mean, we're not seeing any slowdown there, and so it's sort of like this deconstruction, reconstruction. I mean, not that millennials as a generation were ever characterized as being nearly so pessimistic, maybe as Gen X. But Gen Z is really seems to be about trying to put things back together. And critically, I think, Sky, the most important thing for people to understand is that it's getting increasingly harder and harder to characterize any generation, including Gen Z, as a monolith. I mean, Gen Z is the most diverse generation this country's ever produced. And so the idea that Gen Z is or isn't something is sort of, and that's a lot of what our research has shown, is sort of a misnomer at this point.
So how much of that, when you talk about the diversity of Gen Z, there's certain ways that that's pretty obvious, like ethnic and racial diversity. But how much of it is the fact that I'm a Gen Xer, and I recall growing up at a time where, I mean, we didn't have cable until I don't know how old I was, but like there was a sort of unified media engagement in American society, right? We all watched a couple of networks. We all saw the same movies. We all had the big events on TV, whether it was the Oscars or the Super Bowl. How much of the diversity we're seeing in these generational findings are rooted in the fact that we are so fractured socially and living in these isolated media silos? Some of that you see with the conspiracy theory nonsense that's going on, where people occupy different universes of reality. So it's hard to say Americans think X or America is about Y, because there are 1,000 different Americas now based on what your algorithm is driving you to watch, and that's probably accelerated with Gen Z. So when you talk about diversity, is there a way of factoring in that side of it as well?
Yeah, I mean, we can certainly take that into account. It's not, to me, those things are not nearly as important as the larger structural changes. And so if you want, the really big difference between, what happened for your generation, my generation, as I think we're probably about the same age, and what's going on with Gen Z is that, these are fundamental changes in the arrangement of social institutions and how we engage with them. First and foremost is that real wages in this country haven't moved much, if at all, since the early 1980s. So what you've got, the trickle down effect of that are dramatic restructuring of American families, and how much trust we have in the government and economic institutions to do things for us, and how much free time we have, et cetera, et cetera. So this disappearance of the middle class, is probably the single biggest structural trend that drives a difference in generations.
Wait, before you
Yeah,
go
but
further, can you expand that a little bit for folks who aren't familiar with the political and economic realities? What does that mean that wages haven't really gone up since the early 1980s? Practically, what are the implications of
yeah,
that?
sure.
Yeah.
So of course wages have moved in terms of real dollars, but in terms of relative to inflation, what you can actually purchase with those things, it pushes people, it pushes more parents and guardians, et cetera, out of the household. So we've got, not just the desire for all kinds of good reasons that women who were used to be blocked from the workforce are now have it available to them in many cases, though not all. There's not quite equality there by any stretch. But now they're increasingly forced to. I saw this thing the other day, this little article that said that the Simpsons life is no longer possible.
Yeah, I saw that too.
This notion that somehow you could have sort of a menial wage level, wage earners providing for the family of two kids. Like somebody ran the financial analysis and realized that like the cat was going to have to go or something. And I think that's the practical implication there, is that we've got more people living on credit. You've got more people, and this isn't really spring tide's cause. I mean, it's just the sociological reality of what's going on, is that there are more people living at the lower ends of the economic spectrum, and we've got a lot more wealth concentrated in the upper ends. So this sort of like middle ground where the middle class used to be able to have time and resources to support things like churches, mosques, synagogues. It's not so much that they're not interested in those things anymore. They just can't engage with them in the same way because they don't have the same resources available to them that they once did. But I think what we've got in the religious sphere is people still living in this era where it's like, why don't people give like they used to? Why don't they come on Sundays like they used to? Why don't they show up for youth events like they used to?
Right. We have a model of church which is still predicated on a pre-1980s reality.
Which worked really well back then.
Right.
I'm not here to rain on that parade. Like it worked astonishingly well. Part of the message that we want to send at Springtide is like, look, the world has changed. So let's be as innovative now as we once were then, so we can meet young people where they're at and make sure they get the support they need.
That's a theme that's come up a lot on this podcast. It's something I've written about to church leaders. I can't tell you how many conversations I've had with pastors that blame youth sports for the decline of Sunday engagement. And certainly there is an idolatry to youth sports. I've seen, of course, I don't deny that, but they seem to be ignoring larger realities of just the socioeconomic dynamics of America today, where when you have, first of all, the number of households where there is mom, dad, and kids is much smaller than it used to be. And even where those households exist, mom and dad are working their fingers to the bone trying to make ends meet, and the amount of free time and energy they have for engagement in things like church life isn't what it used to be. So
it's very true.
Yeah. And it does call for an innovative response.
And just to follow up on that point about the fractured social media, or media experience and like not having common cultural touchstones, I just want to point out that, so I've been a college professor for, I don't know, over 10 years now, transitioning out of that role. And I've been convinced by my students of something that as a, cisgendered white dude, I don't think I ever would have known if I hadn't had young people who, occupied marginalized identities explain to me, which is that this notion that everybody watched and identified, themselves on Cheers and the Cosby Show or whatever in the night, that was never true. So before the fracturing, right, what we had were a whole bunch of people who simply had no place to find themselves. If you had any kind of marginalized identity, and especially if you didn't live in a major city and you were young and couldn't have freedom to go and find the group of people or the ability to go and find them, you just were out of luck. So it's not that they conformed, they just didn't have a place. And I think part of what we're seeing now is, yes, that leads to the place where you can have a conspiracy theorists, QAnon and all this kind of stuff. But it also leads to a place where you can have young people really exploring, everybody really, but as Springtide are focused on young people, exploring their identities, asking tough questions that maybe they wouldn't be able to, ask in other situations. So there's goods and bads to that.
Okay, let's talk more about trust in institutions. I don't know how many years ago I saw an article in the Atlantic about how American trust in institutions overall is
Mhm.
declining, with I think Congress being at the bottom of the
Yeah.
of the trust ladder. But even institutions that historically have had very high trust, like the military and the church, have declined dramatically since the 1960s. And that study I saw didn't include Gen Z. They were too young probably to be included in it. So is Gen Z accelerating that distrust of institutions, or are they slowing it? What is their view of these American institutions?
You're spot on. The Atlantic article is spot on. We follow all that same data. Gallup and Pew and others have been asking these questions now for half a century. The decline in trust in institutions across all generations is precipitous and well documented. It is the single biggest trend that impacts all of American social life. The Gen Z is not immune to this. So we're the first ones to really track this down to 13-year-olds. And when we ask the question, which we have over 10,000 data points on this, we ask them to rank on a scale of 1 to 10. How much do you trust each of these institutions? And the highest ranking is nonprofits, but even though they're the highest ranking, they still just get a 5.5 on the
Wow.
scale out of 10. And things sort of flow from there. And the bottom spots tend to jockey between the presidency and Congress, as you might imagine. In fact, when I show this stat, I think it's like 7% of people express a lot of trust in Congress, and the people in my audiences want to know why it's so high. But Gen Z is the difference is that I think with Gen Z, what you're seeing and with these young people is that this is the first generation that's really growing up in a world where like they didn't expect to trust. Like the low levels of trust that they have in banks or education or whatever, it's not a shift. Right. So even with millennials, part of what we're capturing in that data is like they were, oh man, it's so disappointing because I was really hoping and expecting for the church to be able to do more for me.
Yeah.
And so part of what you're capturing in that data is just a loss of that expectation. With Gen Z, they never had it in the first place.
So what does that mean? Is it mean they're less cynical? They're less jaded because they just expect the world to be crap from the get-go? Like what's the implications of it?
That's a great question. And I think even in your question, Sky, like it sort of betrays the sort of fundamental worldview that people like you and I have, which is like, oh, if they don't count on institutions, they must be really cynical. But I think the reality with Gen Z is like they don't expect the world to be institutionalized.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not that they're like running around disappointed all the time, right? It's that they just were like the idea that a bank would act in their best interest is like astonished. They're like, you got to be kidding me! Like they never, that was just never a thing that they entertained to begin with. And so they've come up with all these really creative ways to do banking and sharing of money and to save and those kinds of things. And it's the same thing with politics and and media coverage, et cetera. So I don't think it's pessimistic at all. In fact, what we see is that it's really in many cases very generative if you know which questions to ask and if now if you're using the old metrics and measures of like how many young people have savings accounts, how many young people want to buy a house, how many young people show up on Sunday mornings, it's going to look really depressing. But Nancy Emmerman said this really great thing. She's a sociologist from Boston University, emeritus now. And she said, if in a time of significant change, and I'm paraphrasing here, if we're looking in the old places at the same indicators and we don't find as much religious activity, she's writing about religion, then we can't just assume that it's dying because the world has changed. We need to look in new places and at new metrics. And I think once we start looking in those places, we see there's a lot of life going on, just not in the same places that we might have once looked.
I'm so glad to hear you say that because, again, in my interactions with a lot of church leaders, they're pulling their hair out. And especially during COVID, as their institutions are largely empty, they're pulling their hair out in frustration about where are the young people? Why aren't they coming? The church is dying. And the other part of my existence, I'm engaging with a lot of these younger people just in relationship or casual engagements or whatever. And I'm seeing what I would consider the generation that's most ripe for religious engagement, for spiritual awakening. And the fact that their instinct is not to darken the door of a church to find that is what's upsetting. I'm like, okay, well, then is our mission to maintain this institution, or is our mission to engage these young people where they are? And that's, I think, the conflict that a lot of church leaders are having. And part of it is simply practical. Their paycheck comes from the institution.
Well, I would I would hasten to point out that I really think you can do both. I think you can save the institution and engage young people. Look, we did a study this is in the State of Religion and Young People 2020 report that we put out in the fall. But we did a standalone report right at the beginning of COVID. We're going to update it 1 year in. So March of last year, we put this flash survey out in the field, and we asked young people, a myriad of questions about these first stay-at-home orders. And one of them was, who has reached out to you? Check all that apply. Who has reached out to you to find out how you're doing in these first weeks? Less than 2% of young people told us that a religious leader had reached out to them to find out how they were doing.
And
less than 2%.
Of that group you surveyed, though, how many of them have some connection to a religious institution?
Yeah, so good question. So we find that young people, something like 35% of them are claiming no religious affiliation at all. So that means that, like, between families and young, at least I would ballpark 40 to 50%.
See, that's what I would understand
if, like, than two.
Right, exactly. I would understand if only 10% of them had any connection to a religious institution. You go, well, 2% reached out to you, but when half of them, roughly half, hopefully have some connection, but only 2% have enough of a relationship that a religious leader reaches out to them, that's telling.
It really is, and I know that a lot of people picked up that data point and read that data point and think, like, gosh, religious leaders are failing young people in this time of crisis. And I think it speaks more to this, like you mentioned, the structural arrangement. Right. So we have built these systems of really trying and got really good at providing for young people who came to us. But we don't really know what to do when young people can't come to us. And I think it really begs the question, and you've probably seen this too in your own work through, the last 9 months, like COVID has really shown a light on people who, as one of our focus group members put it, we're doing focus groups with youth ministers across the country. Sign up on our website. They said, your youth program is not your youth ministry. And that was just like this aha moment. She's speaking from a very specifically Christian perspective. And this note that, like, there's like the ways that we deliver, modes of delivery, and then there's the thing that we do, right? And sometimes the mode of delivery needs to be changed with, that doesn't mean compromising our values, et cetera, but the modes of delivery should be up for grabs. And if the Friday night event, isn't working anymore, let's ditch the Friday night event.
There was a book I read years ago by James Twitchell, who is a marketing expert, secular marketing expert at a university, I think in Florida. But he wrote this whole book about the church and what he observed in the American church from the point of view of an advertising expert and marketing expert. And he had one chapter on the megachurch. And the title of the chapter was something like, if you've experienced a crisis in the family, please press 9. We've become so enamored with the systems of institutional corporate America in the church that we've tried to systematize ministry.
Yeah.
And so the attitude is, if you don't engage in our systems, then we don't know how to care for you.
Yeah.
And it's such a reversal of the way ministry used to be, where church leaders would spend most of the week outside the church building. They were in the factories and the homes and the hospitals and the jails and the fields, and engaging people in ministry where they were, and then invited them on Sunday morning to gather as a community where they might oversee the liturgy and the worship, but they were out with the people. And now we've reversed that and said, hey, if you don't come to where I work, if you don't engage my program, if you don't come into my ministry structure, I can't help you.
Right.
And I think that's, especially in an era where so many people distrust institutions,
right,
we can't stay in that mode if we're actually going to be faithful to the work that God's called us to.
And I think, if we take a second to just think deeply, you said we've become enamored of corporate structures, but this is where I think the church is probably a little bit behind the curve, because a lot of those corporate structures have figured out this declining trust, trend, and have shifted. I mean, the largest purchaser now of organic foods in the country is either Walmart or Costco, right? Like, they understand that consumers don't trust the massive, institutionalized food production chain. You see all these banks, like, doing these things to try and cater to, like, this coffee shop feel, and Venmo, and, like, transferring money that is, like, only vaguely real. Increasingly, companies and the corporate structures are figuring out how to meet consumers where they're at. And I'm not saying that the church should follow, the religious institutions in this country should follow the corporate institutions. I'm just saying that we can learn some things from that approach already.
So what impact beyond that initial study of only 2% being reached out to by a relationship, what impact do you think COVID and this year of pandemic is going to have on Gen Z? And what should religious institutions and leaders take from what's happened?
Well, it's an accelerant. I mean, COVID doesn't. I don't think COVID is going to fundamentally alter. I mean, not alter. I'm sorry. I don't think COVID is going to fundamentally change things that didn't exist pre-COVID. Um, in the grand scheme of things, this is going to be 18 months or so before life. I mean, I anticipate that at least as we sit here today. I mean, who knows what's going to happen, but it looks like everybody's going back to school in the fall, and a lot of that normalcy will return to people's lives in terms of their routines. But what this period of time has done is accelerated a lot of trends that were already there. So we wrote the theme for the State of Religion and Young People 2020 was all about relational authority, because what young people kept telling us is that they're not interested in the institutions. They're very interested in the conversation. They want not friends. They want adults who are this combination of like guide and mentor, but also expert, but not just lecturing them. So we teased that out and put it together in this framework that can actually be scalable, right? Because if we're outside of the walls of the church all the time, we have to figure out a way that we can train people, because we can only hold so many relationships. You know what I mean? Like if you have a youth ministry of 150 people or so at a big church, you can't be in deep relationship with 150 young people, and God help you if you tried. I'm not sure that would be good for your sanity. So we have to find dimensions here that we can train people on, and I think that's the big trend that's going to be accelerated through COVID. If you're not doing things through relationships, it's just not going to stick.
So I mean that's not entirely surprising. I mean, relationships have been the vehicle of discipleship since the New Testament was written. But what does that mean? Going back to the very first thing you talked about, which is the economic reality that people are facing. They have less free time. They feel more strain. Family structures are stressed out by that reality. When people have fewer, not only do they have less time and resources to engage in meaningful relationship, but I don't know if there's stats on this, but it seems like for a younger generation that has been grazed on a screen, they also seem to have less of the empathy and personal skills to actually engage in meaningful relationship. Are we eroding the capacity to actually disciple the next generation between all those factors?
I think you're right. I mean, it is a large part of what has to happen here, and we write about this is the modeling. I mean, so there are some things that we can do, from a social science perspective to help model good relationships for young people in terms of our one-to-one interactions with them, and that's critical because we are not designed or intended from a biological standpoint, let alone a religious one, to be isolated creatures. And in fact, for a really long time, social isolation has been this signal to your body and through this pain response. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with the neuroscience here, but the pain of isolation is felt in the same place of your brain, is experienced in the same part of your brain as physical pain, like dropping a hammer on your foot. And a pain signal in your body is really just a way of saying like something is not sustainable here. If you put your hand on a stove, it's or on a burner or something, right? Like the pain impulse is to get you to move it away so you don't hurt yourself. Well, the pain impulse of social isolation was to say like go back to the group, because you can't survive like this.
Yeah.
But in 2020, we can survive like that, and as much as like we can just avoid the pain by going into our own bubbles, and we see a lot of young people doing this, and in the sort of like result of that is that I think we do lose the ability of young people. We're losing the ability for young people to engage in like productive, meaningful relationships. At Springtide, we stand on the ground of social science and we let people bring their theology to it. So whatever that theology is, we're going to equip you with the best knowledge that psychology, sociology, et cetera, can bring, so that you can be the most effective at your job working with young people. And there are a lot of things that we can do, like norms of reciprocity. So, if you ever go through that set of double doors and you hold open the first one and the person walks through it, and then, even though it's only 10 steps later or whatever, they hold open the next one and you walk through it. And so you're both back right where you started. It's this crazy thing. That's a simple thing that works in conversations too. So one of the 5 dimensions of relational authority is transparency. By you being transparent about something, sharing something from your life when you were a young person, it creates this like deficit in the relationship that we naturally want to fill. So the young person will see that as both a signal that it's okay to share, and they'll sense this like requirement that they should share about their own lives. But young people are just so used to being dismissed. I interviewed somebody for our Voices of Young People podcast early on, and she said, the dominant experience of the young person is with adults is being not listened to, being invisible, being dismissed. And I see this like when I mentor students, talk to them in my own office, when I say, I ask them about what they want to do with their lives, and their first response is always like, they sort of blow me off, and it's not until I ask the second and third follow up question, they're like, oh, this guy's serious, like he actually wants to know what I want to do with my life. And it's those kinds of things of like, they're not expecting to be listened to. We have to do some things to create that relationship, and we have to be really intentional about pursuing and finding the spaces where they're at and going there so we can model those things, because I think you're right, otherwise it's going to be lost.
Okay, last question on kind of where we are with the pandemic and stuff. One of the things I'm concerned about is that church leaders are going to learn the wrong lesson from this past year. And the wrong lesson is, wow, I can do ministry just as effectively using technology. We can just disincarnate the church and still engage relationally. I'm using air quotes through social media, through Zoom, through whatever we're using. What gets lost? I mean, you've talked this whole time about the importance of relationships, of building trust, of reciprocity, all those things that need to happen for real engagement. What gets lost when it's attempted only through a screen?
Well, something like 2/3 of communication is nonverbal, right? I mean, and tone, like these are the things that young people are terrible at anyway. I mean, that's part of being socialized and growing up, is like learning how much tone is the appropriate amount to communicate things like sarcasm or affection without love or something like that. And these are the kinds of things that I think get lost behind just words on the screen. So you say you can't do, the wrong lesson would be to just think that you could do ministry only through technology. But I think the right lesson here would probably be to think that I can't do effective ministry without technology. I mean, I think you have to be engaged at some level.
Right.
But you're right, like thinking about it as like this silver bullet approach that we could somehow hole up in our offices and apartments and engage with young people that way. It should be a gateway and a bridge to actually having conversations.
Okay, finally, in the last couple of minutes, let's talk about what your research has uncovered about young people, politics, and faith. So, no doubt Gen Z has just as much of a negative view of the institutions of government as the rest of us do. But what are you finding about in the research? What's it saying to you about where I talk to my own kids about this, but my kids are between the ages of 19 and 13. Mm-hmm. And their childhood memories of government was largely Barack Obama. And now in their adolescence, it's Donald Trump in this case. And you can just see them pull back and repulsed by everything that's unfolded. And that cynicism, I'm worried, is going to be with them permanently. Whereas I grew up in the era of Ronald Reagan, and to think what you want of his politics, there was this shining city on a hill hopefulness about one's view of America. Even I was too young to understand the nuances of all that.
Sure.
So what's your data showing about this generation's attitude about politics and especially its impact on their faith?
So I'll start off with an anecdote, which is, it's right before the last election in 2016. I was giving a presentation unrelated to Springtide. This is before Springtide was even started. And I was giving a presentation at a seminary here in Colorado. And it was like the night before, the day before. And I said, if Trump wins and does so with broad evangelical support, then the ramifications here for a generation of young people are going to be significant. And the polls at that time suggested that was unlikely, but indeed that's what came to be. And I think that's largely what we've seen over the last 4 years. And I don't mean that because the evangelical position is wrong or because Trump's politics are wrong. I meant that, and I think it's come true because of the rhetoric. The same thing that you just mentioned, that it's not this shining city on a hill, but it's so divisive. So when we did our study, over half of young people say that adults don't give them enough credit for what they know about politics. And check this out: 65% of them say that when we ask them, like, how would you describe adults when they engage in political conversation, 65% of them said aggressive, dismissive, and disengaged. And only 35% said considerate and inviting. And that's what I mean by like this sort of, and I'm not saying that that's necessarily that that's a function of any one person. That's part of the culture that we're in. But that's the young people intensely desire to be a part of political conversations. They, especially Gen Z, wants to be part of this rebuilding, reconstruction to figure out what new institutions might look like that they would trust. But the way that adults engage them, and we didn't ask these questions from a Democrat lens or Republican lens. I mean, these are not ideas. We didn't even ask their affiliation. That's just how they think of adults now when it comes to politics. And so it leads you to wonder then, sort of like, what is the connection there between, if adults aren't letting them into important conversations about politics, and when they engage in important conversations, they seem aggressive and dismissive. Well, then how do we have important conversations about other things like faith? And we see similar kinds of data over there that young people just don't see a lot of the adults that they currently have in their lives as places where they can have conversations.
So what's the alternative? Are they just turning to their peers?
Yeah. This is the $1 million question, and we were sort of shocked by this data. So the thrust of the State of Religion report in the key finding sections, we sort of tease out why these notions of affiliated and disaffiliated as categories no longer hold. So we used to be able to assume a whole bunch of things. If somebody said they were affiliated with a particular religious tradition, there were like a checklist of things we could assume that would flow from that, and vice versa for disaffiliated people. But the reality is much more complex. Something like half of young people who say they're affiliated, or close to half, have no trust in religious institutions, or very little trust, even though they claim an affiliation. So what we're spending 2021 trying to figure out is then, okay, so where are they going? Like, how are they having these conversations, and what are they doing? And I think it really is sort of what we're learning so far anyway, is that it really is a mixed bag. They're getting bits and pieces of things here and there, but we know what they want. What they want are adults who are a combination of expert and guide, who will listen to them and share with them and engage with them, but they just have not yet, and for many of them, been able to find it.
And they're not looking for that adult religious mentor through an institution, most likely.
They're not opposed to them being affiliated with an institution necessarily, but you're right. Like, they are not seeking them out in those places. And I can hear the echoes already of some people who would say, well, then, why not? But I would point out that, like, if your criticism, or if your response to young people's faith exploration comes back to blaming young people for not doing enough, I think you're probably coming at them, at this issue from the wrong approach. So I don't know that it's incumbent upon the young person to come to what we've already decided is the best thing.
Oh, wow. Okay, Josh, we're kind of out of time here, but I'd love for you to stick around to do a bonus conversation for our Patreon supporters. And
happy to do it.
But just to whet their appetite here, you wrote a book 5 years ago, or released a book about 5 years ago, called Church Refugees. And the subtitle is Sociologists Reveal Why People Are Done with Church But Not Their Faith. So I got this book 5 years ago. It's not a big book, but it was transformative. And it articulated not just what I had seen as a church leader, but it actually articulated my own experience as a Christian in the church. And it's probably one of the books I have referenced most frequently. And it's one that I recommend all the time to church leaders when they're pulling their hair out, like I said earlier, about what's going on in their congregation, is that you have to read this book. So I want to talk to you about it in our bonus segment. And for those of you who have supported our podcast through Patreon, you'll get to hear that conversation. Whether or not you are a Patreon supporter of the Holy Post, you need to pick up Church Refugees. It's an illuminating read. And grateful, Josh, that you guys did that research and put it together. So let's stick around for a few minutes and we'll talk about that. And for the rest of you, we will see you next week. Thank you for joining us for another episode of The Holy Post.
The Holy Post podcast is a production of Phil Vischer Enterprises, that's Phil's company, and Sky Pilot Media, that's Sky's company. Production assistance by Julie Betcher. Editing by Jason Rugg. Help us create more thoughtful Christian media by supporting us at patreon.com/Holy Post. Also, be sure to leave a review on iTunes so more people can discover thoughtful Christian commentary plus ukulele and occasional butt news. Visit holypost.com for show notes, news stories, and more.